So my name is Susanna Morrison-Metóis. Thank you, Andrew. I'm a senior research fellow at ALNAP, and I'll be moderating the event today. So like Thomas said, it's a packed agenda. We're going to start with a short presentation of ALNAP's recent paper on real-time evaluations and real-time learning during COVID-19 in just a minute. And then we're going to have the panel discussion where we're going to hear experiences from both UNEG and ALNAP members. So I won't go through the list of organizations which you just heard. After that, we have around 20 minutes for an audience Q&A, and then we'll finally have closing remarks from John Mitchell. And after that, if you have time, we have a 20-minute optional networking for those of you who can stay on further. So next, in order to get started, we set up a bit of a Mentimeter, just to get a sense of people's experience in the room today. So basically, the way this works is in the chat function, you should see a link to Mentimeter. So if you can click on that link, the first question that we want to ask you actually is what word comes to mind when you hear the term real-time evaluation? So you can click on the link, open it, and then type in a word or a phrase. What do you associate with real-time evaluation? So I'm going to give you just a minute, I think, and we can see it, the word cloud coming. So one thing I've heard a lot of people say is real-time evaluation sounds sexy, but people don't always know what they mean. So I'm quite curious, I think, to know what people associate it with. Rapid, okay, immediate use, emergency, ongoing, useful, okay, that's great. Utility, steer management, okay, that one's different. Developmental evaluation, yeah, there's a big question of how developmental evaluation fits with RTE, I think. Okay, yeah, okay, great. So I think all of those terms are, what I associate also with real-time evaluation. So for those of you not familiar, that gives you a little bit of a taste. So our next question then in Mentimeter, if we can go to the next question, is just to get a sense of your level of experience for those of you who are in the event today with us. If you want to fill out, have you done RTEs? Have you not? So while you're doing that, if we can just go to the next slide very quickly. Maria, if you can pull up the next slide here. So I just want to share with you ALNAP's definition of real-time evaluation. So in 2009, ALNAP produced a publication. It was a guide to real-time evaluation. So the definition that we had was any evaluation in which the primary objective is to provide feedback in a participatory way in real time, i.e. such as during the evaluation process, to those executing and managing the humanitarian response. So that, in a nutshell, basically, is ALNAP's existing definition of RTE since at least 2009. So Maria, can we just go back to the results of the poll to get a sense of how many people have experience with RTE? If we can just bring up the poll results really quickly. Okay, great. So I have regularly done, so we have maybe 11% who have regularly done them. Quite a few who know what RTEs are, so that's great. Maybe you didn't need the definition. But then the 22% who have no experience or knowledge of RTE, I really hope that that definition and then our short presentation is going to help at least give you an idea about RTEs. Next slide, please, if we can go. So to frame the topic for the event today, as I said, we're going to be just sharing a few highlights from a recent ALNAP paper on real-time learning. So this work came out of previous ALNAP research that we did early last year. And what it was is we were looking at how M&E practices were impacted by COVID, but also how M&E practices adapted. And one of the things that we kept hearing from ALNAP members was that they had designed a variety of forms of quick learning reviews or real-time assessments. But what was really interesting to me is that most of these were actually not being called real-time evaluations, even though many of them use the word real-time. Next slide, please. So what we were hearing about was this wide range of reviews, assessments, and evaluative exercises. And they were all producing rapid learning, most of them in fairly short timeframes, and all with this objective to support the ongoing response to COVID. Now, each organization had a slightly different name for their exercise, and some were much more formal than others. And what happened is when we looked at the variety of exercises and we wanted to write about them, we realized that we needed a new term. So many of these didn't fit the term of real-time evaluation. It didn't fit the definition that we had in our existing guide. So what we did is we came up with a new term, a broader term, and that was real-time learning. So real-time learning for us in the paper is really an umbrella category. So it's wider than real-time evaluation. Real-time evaluation is just one subset. So real-time learning then also includes real-time assessments, real-time reviews, and then a variety of other forms of rapid learning reviews that have these short feedback loops. Next slide, please. So now in a previous ALNAP publication, we had an image that was showing a spectrum of evaluative exercises from informal reviews on one side to more formal traditional evaluation on the other. And as you can see, the evaluation exercises to the left-hand side of the spectrum, those are the ones that we have now labeled as real-time learning. So basically, we needed a term to talk around these different types of reviews and evaluations that had a lot of overlap. So in the recent paper that we published, what we did is we reviewed over a dozen real-time learning exercises that ALNAP members undertook during COVID-19. And we described the methods and the approaches used. And the aim for ALNAP was really to share examples and tips for practitioners, but without being overly prescriptive. So not telling people how to do it, but rather sharing information of how other organizations have approached these. So with that, I'm going to hand over now to Margie Buchanan-Smith, who worked with ALNAP on the paper. So Margie is very well known in humanitarian evaluation circles, and she co-authored ALNAP's 2016 guide on evaluation of humanitarian action in addition to this paper. So Margie, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Susanna. And I'm going to start by saying a little bit more about the drive towards real-time learning that both Susanna and Andrew have referred to during the COVID-19 response, and then focus on what worked from the range of RTL exercises that we heard about while we were doing the research for the paper. And throughout, I'm going to use quotes from interviewees that we spoke to that you'll see on the slides, which kind of illustrate some of the key messages that emerged whilst we were doing this research. So first of all, the quote, "We have a structured way of doing RTEs, but the global COVID pandemic blew it out of the water." So this really captures how the COVID-19 response required a very different way of working for many evaluation functions. And from the practitioner side, there was quite a lot of dissatisfaction with traditional evaluation. It was seen as too institutionalized and inflexible, and it was generating some resistance in the highly pressurized context in which practitioners and program people were working. And then evaluation managers were looking for something lighter and more flexible to meet kind of immediate learning needs. And then the global scale of the pandemic was a challenge on both fronts, to the response itself, but also to the design of learning methods that were appropriate across an organization, across countries, across regions. So this really was an invitation, and in many ways a necessity, to be as utilization focused as possible. But I think importantly, it really required thinking outside the box. And the consequence was this wave of real-time learning exercises that Susanna mentioned across the sector within NGOs, UN agencies, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. So moving to the next slide, this slide captures what in many ways is described as the journey of real-time learning exercises. And it describes that journey from implicit to explicit knowledge. So from the individual and team levels to the organizational level. And RTLs have been described by some as inviting staff to tell a story, to tell their story. And I think key features of this RTL journey is making sure that there's space for collective reflection and learning, making sure that findings are kind of sense checked and validated so that they do become organizational knowledge, and then ensuring that that explicit organizational knowledge is really internalized by staff along the journey. So moving to the next slide, what I'm going to focus on now is what we identified in the paper as some of the success factors in real-time learning exercises. So this first one is about seizing learning opportunities as they arise. So there was this keen interest to learn and adapt programs. There was an interest and a desire to learn across country programs, across regions, but also to learn about the quality of programs as they were being adapted. And these RTL exercises seem to be most successful when that opportunity, that hunger to learn was kind of spotted, was grasped, and the evaluation function really responded very fast in designing some kind of real-time learning exercise. It didn't always mean there was a lot of time for planning, but by acting fast, that really helped to ensure that the exercise got off to a good start. Secondly, ensuring wide buy-in. So senior management buy-in has often been key, as this quote indicates. And for some organizations, that meant right from the top, for example, from the executive director. So that was important to send a message about the importance of the exercise across the organization and therefore the importance of engaging. But that also really helped with the take-up of findings, especially where there might be kind of difficult or uncomfortable messages emerging. Moving to the next slide, the next success factor, which is a really important one, is this one about adapting the approach to fit the organization. And I think the key message here is to be driven by the learning needs of the organization rather than by evaluation protocols. So some agencies deliberately dropped the RTE label. The evaluation label was sometimes regarded as a loaded term, overly associated with accountability, with certain expectations that generated resistance when staff were working under huge pressure. And evaluation managers wanted to convey that these exercises, that they were different, that they were light touch, that they were less demanding, and they were more responsive to practitioners' learning needs. And I think we'll hear more about this from some of our panelists. But as this was often, for many organizations, it was kind of like a global learning exercise, the big challenge was how to make such a daunting task manageable. And there are a number of different approaches that different agencies use. I'm just going to mention two right now. One way of making this daunting task manageable was by breaking it into different components, which would be carried out simultaneously. So different parallel exercises. So for example, War Child Holland commissioned a real-time review to capture the grassroots perspective at the same time as a second exercise that looked at management and coordination issues from the perspective of agency staff. So carrying out two parallel exercises simultaneously was one approach. Another approach was adopting a kind of phased approach. This was adopted by Danish Refugee Council, for instance. So the early phase of the real-time learning exercise was retrospectively looking back at the first few months of scaling up an adaptation to capture what had worked and what had needed to be adapted. And that informed the second phase, which was a number of deep dives in 4 different countries, looking at some of the practical consequences and implications of the issues that had been raised in the first exercise. For example, duty of care to staff versus stay and deliver. And I think we may hear from panelists about a third approach, which is a more kind of layering approach that World Vision and UNICEF adopted, for example. In terms of the analytical framework that agencies used, and again, this varied enormously, and I think we'll hear more about that from the panelists. Many UN agencies use the conventional OECD DAC criteria, evaluation criteria, and a number of international NGOs use the Common Humanitarian Standard, the CHS, on quality and accountability. And their reason for doing that was that they felt that they were often more concrete and tangible and more operational, and therefore more accessible to the practitioners and program people that their real-time learning exercises were targeting. So on agency responsiveness, there's a CHS standards on complaints being welcomed and addressed, and also looking for evidence that humanitarian actors are continuously learning and improving. The next success factor is this one about creating a learning space that's open, that's receptive, and that's safe. So some agencies deliberately used appreciative inquiry to kind of avoid a sort of fault-finding approach, but instead focusing much more on recognizing and appreciating efforts that staff had made and results that were achieved. At least 3 NGOs that we spoke to really paid attention to capturing and celebrating success. And some of them said that one of the most important questions they asked of staff is, what are you most proud of? And it was quite interesting to see what answers emerged. And that doesn't have to be at odds with identifying and addressing challenges and course correction, but it was just generally regarded as a much more motivating way of engaging staff. The next success factor is investing in interpersonal skills. So this has long been recognized as important, particularly in real-time evaluation. And this would include facilitation skills, to encourage staff to reflect critically on their operation, on their response, and to find creative solutions to any challenges and difficulties emerging. Diplomatic skills, perhaps to engage very busy staff, and also to communicate more challenging findings, and especially the ability to listen. And by some, that was regarded as equal value to the kind of technical expertise that you'd look for in the evaluators. But I think these interpersonal skills were more important than ever in the pandemic, to build rapport and trust with staff who are working, as I've already mentioned, in kind of very pressurized contexts. And particularly as many evaluators were working remotely, where there were pre-existing relationships of trust, that really helped the exercise get off to a good start and work well and be regarded as kind of credible. So moving to the next slide, I'm going to mention 2 more success factors. So first of all, building learning into the process. So the key message here is to pay attention to the process more than the final report. And I think there's a really big question for many of us in the evaluation sector about whether we've become too fixated on the final report, and what other mechanisms can we use both to encourage learning, but also to kind of communicate findings. So a lot of interesting methods were pioneered in these real-time learning exercises, and I think we'll hear about some of them from the panelists, but they kind of ranged from maybe just a 1-hour, well-facilitated reflective learning exercise in a senior management meeting, and it's certainly an approach that I used very recently in an evaluation with UNHCR in Sudan, to perhaps a full-day workshop. So Oxfam, for instance, they, in their real-time reviews, have a day of reflection after the data has been collected, when findings are shared, reviewed, validated with staff, and action plans are jointly developed. And they followed that process, even though it had to be done remotely, for the real-time review of the COVID response. Ensuring safety and ethical engagement. Critical part of telling the story of the COVID response was staff talking about their own personal experience. And for many, talking to an independent evaluator was the first time that this had been possible. And so in some exercises, real-time learning exercises, the kind of stress and trauma that staff had experienced began to emerge through the RTL exercises, which meant that it could on occasion be quite an emotional experience. And I think there's a real learning point, again, for us as evaluators, to make sure that interviewers are trained to recognize trauma, to know how to respond empathetically, and also had knowledge of referral mechanisms or knew when to raise issues with HR departments or others in the organization. So in conclusion, the need to adapt to the pandemic and to think outside the box, it's really unleashed a wave of creativity and innovation. And it was exciting in doing this, the research for this ALNAP paper, was to kind of hear the level of of excitement and of creativity that really came with the context in which people were working. But I think it really raises a question for us in the evaluation sector. Have we become too set in our ways? And are we being too driven by protocol that we forget to ask if we're really meeting the learning needs of the organizations that we're working for? And I think being truly utilization focused means continually asking what an organization and its staff need from an RTL, and then being flexible in our approach to meet that need and to know when it's appropriate to let go of some of those evaluation protocols and to adapt. So let me pause there and back to you, Susanna.